This experience was when I was a kid, so some of it must be a bit fuzzy, but the pivotal points are forever etched in my mind. We lived at the time in a small town in Kansas. Our house sat in the middle of enormous wheat fields that seemed to just keep going on, especially to a kid like me. I was around 11 years old, and cycling to school was my daily routine as my parents were usually occupied with work. It was easier for all of us that way. Our house was on the outskirts of town, just past one of those big wheat fields. The shortest way to school would have been across the field straight, but my parents had emphasized one rule: never shortcut across the wheat. They were afraid I might get lost, and without a cell phone, I'd be unable to call for help, no matter how dire the situation. It was an easy rule to obey. The scope of the field and the way it seemed to engulf everything silently was enough to make me remain on the highway. I didn't have many friends at home, so my journeys to and from school were usually alone. But I was content with that. Cycling was a wonderful source of freedom. At weekends, I'd ride out on long excursions, exploring the deserted back roads and coming to love it more and more. One day, while cycling home from school as I usually did, something went wrong. My bike chain came loose, totally derailing my trip. I attempted everything my dad had instructed me on how to repair it, but nothing was working. I found myself stuck, and walking home the long distance with my bike strapped behind me seemed too much to bear. Without a phone to call for assistance and not wanting to flag down strangers, I was not left with much. That was when I glanced over at the wheat field. Cutting straight through it would shave off so much time. I understood my parents' warning, but I justified that it couldn't be that hard to cross. All I had to do was go straight ahead, right? I thought about it for a second. Then I cut across and pushed my bike into the field. I believed, initially, that I had acted correctly. The spaces between the rows of wheat were passable, and a soft breeze rustled against the stalks. But the farther I went, the taller and denser the wheat grew. The sunlight became less bright, and an eerie quiet dropped around me. I'd glance over my shoulder every few paces, a nervous reflex I couldn't shake. The longer I remained in the field, the more uncomfortable I became, even though I couldn't quite identify the reason. A couple of minutes later, I began to hear gentle rustling sounds in the wheat that surrounded me. I first convinced myself it was the wind, but the noise did not coincide with my movement. It would stop when I stopped, and restart when I began to move again. It was not long before my anxiety transformed into fear. The likelihood of some animal following me came to mind, but the noise seemed too deliberate, too calculated. I tried to rush along, holding tight to the bike. Leaves creaked louder, drawing near with each step that I took. My breathing was light, and I prayed in desperation that I had never entered the field. Suddenly, the rustling was over, and there was relief. I was convinced that I had passed through. But then, turning a corner between the shelves, I saw him. A man was standing there, right in the middle of the walkway. He was filthy, with tattered and dirty clothes. Long, jagged scrapes went down his arms, red and puffy looking. He just stood there without even flinching, his arms at his sides. I froze, scared. He spoke to me, his voice low and raspy, asking if I was lost. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even move. He then came over to me, telling me he'd walk me home. Every part of me screamed for me to run, but my legs didn't obey. It wasn't until he extended his arms, coming closer, that my instincts kicked in. I abandoned my bike and took off running. He pursued me, cutting through the wheat as he shouted at me to halt. He claimed he had only wanted to help, but his tone and the rope in his hand proved otherwise. I ran through the stalks, occasionally diving into the thick wheat to hide. I crouched close to the earth, trembling, hoping he couldn't find me. Each time he stopped by, I'd hold my breath, pounding hard in my chest. I could hear him muttering to himself, his words giving me chills. "I'll find him." I took cover for what felt like hours. My legs were knotted, and my body was sore, but I didn't budge until I was sure he had left. Eventually, I crept out and staggered my way out of the field. When I got home, it was evening, and I was trembling so violently that I could barely speak. My parents were sick with worry, and when I told them what happened, my mom cried while my dad's face reddened with rage. My dad searched for my bicycle the next day, but it was gone. It was a few weeks later, and something happened that forced us to pack up and get out of town. I came home from school one day, and there on our front porch stood my bicycle, the same one that I had left in the field. We had no idea how it had gotten there or who had returned it. That did it for my parents. They did not feel safe anymore, and we soon moved away. My parents barely speak of what occurred even now, but the memory is still alive in my head. I will never forget that day in the wheat field or the man who was waiting there. I was 32 then. I had recently come back to the rural area to help my parents operate their small orchard. Both of them were past 60, and the physical work of keeping the place going was too strenuous for them. The farm was situated in a remote area of Maine, with apple trees going on for miles in rows. Our nearest neighbor was about a quarter-mile walk away, a retired gentleman who probably spent most of his time fishing or sitting on his porch reading. Life on the orchard was peaceful, but slow. After years of trying a career in architecture that hadn't gone as I had hoped, the slow pace of farm life was a relief. My days were spent in the trees and my evenings in writing a novel that I'd been working on for years. My parents' home was cozy but old-fashioned, and I had inherited the attic room. It had a small window that looked out over the orchard, and I had a fantastic view of the rows and rows of trees. About 3 weeks into my stay, I started to see something odd. Each night, at the exact moment the sun dipped below the horizon, I would glimpse a figure standing at the edge of the orchard. At first, I assumed it had to be our neighbor, perhaps out walking or taking in the view. The figure was always too far away to make out any details, but something about it unsettled me. It never moved. It simply stood there, perfectly still, as if it were part of the landscape. I mentioned it to my parents, but they dismissed it as a trick of the light or my imagination. My mother even joked that I'd been spending too much time staring at my computer screen. But the days went by, and the figure did not vanish. Instead, it started encroaching. It stood each evening at the tree line, just a little closer to the house. I began to worry. One evening, I decided to go and take a peep. I went there with a flashlight, heading towards the edge of the orchard where I saw the figure last. Getting closer to the place, I felt the shiver down my spine. Arriving there was nothing but the fragrance of soil and apples. I talked myself into thinking it was nothing, perhaps a shadow or an imagination run wild, but I just felt that something was not right inside. That night, I watched at my attic window. As expected, shortly after the sun had set, the figure reappeared. It was nearer this time than the initial, standing near the small wooden tool shed where we stored our equipment. I saw no features, but it produced a chill. It felt like whoever or whatever it was knew that I was watching. The next day, I talked to my parents again. My father assumed it might be a deer or some other animal. My mother, the eternal optimist, believed it might be the neighbor's grandson who was visiting for the summer, but I could tell that they were on the verge of sympathizing with me. My father promised to check the orchard at nightfall, but when the time came, the apparition failed to materialize again. For a few days, everything returned to normal. Then one night, the lights were out. I was working in the barn completing late-night tasks when the entire property was plunged into darkness. I thought at first that it was simply a routine blackout, but as I moved to take out my flashlight, I heard something. It was a rustling sound, soft but deliberate, coming from the orchard. My heart began racing. I shone the flashlight up at the trees and didn't see anything at first. I then caught sight of a movement out of my peripheral vision. A man, or at least something close to a man, stood just in the extremity of the beam. He was lean, extremely tall, with tattered clothing hanging off his emaciated body. His face was partly hidden, but his eyes shone in the darkness, and he had something clutched in his hand. It resembled an ancient pruning saw. Panic struck. I ran back inside the house, closing the door after me. My parents had already been awake, having been awakened by the loss of electricity. I told them what I'd seen, and my dad immediately called the sheriff's office. The police arrived in under an hour and searched the grounds but found nothing. They did confirm that the master breaker box had been tampered with. Somebody had deliberately cut the power. The sheriff offered to increase patrols in the neighborhood, but the experience left me unsettled. I lay awake at my window for several nights afterwards, but the figure did not reappear. My parents installed motion-sensing lights around the property, and we all tried to go back to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever or whoever had been lurking in the orchard wasn't finished yet. 7 days after, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of banging. It was coming from the shed. I grabbed a flashlight and, much against my will, proceeded to check it out. The shed door was open because of the wind, and the tools on the ground were scattered all over. I first thought that it might have been some creature, but I then saw something that made my blood run cold. On the wooden door there was written, "I'm still here." That was the last straw. My parents sold the farm and relocated to town. I helped them pack and move, and within months the orchard was abandoned. I have no idea who or what was haunting our property, but I'm glad we left when we did. To this day, I still get a chill down my spine whenever I happen to catch a glimpse of lines of trees stretching towards the horizon. Some shadows are better left unexplored. I was 32 years of age and had recently undergone a radical shift in my life. Living in the hustle and bustle of the city of Denver had drained me, and I needed desperately to retreat to a more serene surrounding. That's how I relocated to a quiet, unpretentious small town in Nebraska. There was nothing remarkable about the town itself, but it gave me the escape from population and noise that I craved. I took a job at a local hardware store. That kind of job that earned the paycheck without demanding much from me. It was the kind of simplicity I needed, at least for the time being. The rental house was plain and remarkably cheap. It was a small, one-story house with chipped paint and a vast yard that bordered a neglected cornfield overgrown in weeds. The previous property owner had clearly relinquished any claim of maintaining it. The yard was enormous, stretching out into fields of high corn stalks that creaked and swayed in the wind. The fence from the yard into the field was leaning, barely upright, and appeared to be able to fall over with a strong wind. Despite the way that it was, the home and the scenery had a sense of charm to them. It was cut off from the rest of the world, and that was exactly what I required. My first couple of months, I settled into a routine. My mornings were spent at work, and nights were mine. I'd sit on the back porch, with often a cup of coffee, and take in the vista over the endless sea of corn. There was something mesmerizing in the swaying of stalks with the wind. It was my routine to sit and reflect upon my life as the sun set, the colors blending into the horizon and casting a golden glow on the field. It was a kind of peace I had not experienced for years. All this came to an end one fall evening in late October. The wind had turned cold and cut through the area. I'd always enjoyed nights like this. There was something exciting about the cold and how the wind sliced through the corn. I'd stepped outside onto the deck to smoke a cigarette, wrapping my jacket around me. The air was bitter, the sky filled with stars, and all was quiet until I heard it. A scream. It pierced the silence, harsh and unmistakably man-made. It was a kid's sound, maybe a child, and from the cornfield direction. It was so sudden and startling that I froze. My mind flew through a list of things, none of which were good. Not thinking, I ran into the house, grabbed the old emergency-used hunting rifle, and ran back out. The scream again, louder. My heart pounded as I jumped over the fence and dove into the field. The rows of corn loomed above me, rustling in the wind that blew up through them. I yelled, demanding that whoever it was reply, but the field swallowed my voice. The only response was silence. I picked a row randomly and took off running, the phone's flashlight not doing much to illuminate the way. The scream did not come again. At last, after what seemed like hours of looking, I realized that I wasn't going to find anybody. I phoned the police and reported what I had heard and waited for them to arrive. The officers looked through the field with me, scanning down each row, but there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of passage, not the slightest indication that anyone had passed through. They vowed they'd keep an eye out, but speculated perhaps it was a prank or even a pet. I wasn't certain, but what other options did I have? I went back inside the residence, feeling uneasy, reminding myself that it was probably kids pulling pranks. I was home a few nights later, preparing for bed, when something in the yard caught my attention. Out the window, I could see a soft orange light in the distance. My stomach dropped as I realized it was fire. It was crawling up from the cornfield, small and then growing, their light dancing wildly in the night. I grabbed the garden hose and ran outside, my heart racing. The wind assisted it, propelling it along and feeding the fire, driving it toward the fence. The hose was barely long enough, and I was drenched by the spray, but I managed to put out the fire before it had time to spread. I caught my breath, gazing back, trying to figure out what had just happened, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned and braced myself. Someone was in my second-story window, staring down at me. The form was indistinct and dark, but there was no question about the fact. Panic set in as I lost the hose and headed for the house. When I flung open the door, the scene was one of disorder. The kitchen was trashed, cabinets open, plates shattered, food scattered all over the floor. I barely had time to look at it all when I heard the front door slam shut. Whoever had been in the house was out. I once again sprinted outside, gazing out over the yard and the field, but neither of them could be seen anywhere. They seemed to have vanished into thin air. This time the police arrived sooner and took the situation very seriously. They arrived with dogs and scoured every inch of the house and surrounding area, but like before, they found nothing. The arson had been deliberate, and there was clear evidence inside the house of something being broken, indicating an intruder, but they had nothing to go on. The officers assured me that they'd increase patrols in the area, but it was little comfort. The subsequent weeks were a nightmare. Creaks, wind gusts made me anxious. I kept the rifle next to me, flinching at every little sound. I couldn't help but believe that whoever had visited my place was still lurking around, waiting for me. The peaceful isolation that used to fill me with so much joy had become a cell of terror. I finally packed up and left. I could no longer stay in that house after all that. I left a motion sensor camera behind and double-checked the locks before I left, hoping it would provide the next occupant with some peace of mind. Even months down the line, though, I just can't shake it from my mind. The scream, the fire, the window figure all run round and round in my head. I still don't know who or what was out there, and maybe I never will.